Well, that was an excellent start to this year's Brussels Forum. It also, in many ways, set the stage for the next panel on the multipolar dimension of transatlantic relations. We really have a terrific lineup of people for this next panel, and especially I want to note the moderator, David Ignatius, who has also been involved with the Brussels Forum from the very start. I think initially we got him here to do one session. The next year he probably ended up doing 2 or 3. He also happened to be on the board of the German Marshall Fund, so we had an extra way to make some demands on him. At various points, he's filled in at the last minute on different kinds of sessions and always done just an extraordinarily good job. So with that, I want to introduce David Ignatius, and he'll introduce his panel. David, thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Welcome to everyone. Let me ask the panelists to come on stage. You'll see Senator George Voinovich, Baroness Ashton, the EU High Commissioner, President Toomas Ilves of Estonia, and Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is the Director of Policy Planning, widely thought, at least by me, to be the best job in the U.S. government. We discussed what arrangements we would make in terms of the formalities of this, and I addressed Baroness Ashton as Baroness Ashton, and she said, "That's Kathy." And then I addressed President Ilves, and he said, "That's Tom." So the first thing I want to say is that in the transatlantic relationship this year, we are on a first-name basis. So if you think we're being awfully casual, it's because of prior agreement. Let me say one thing to set the scene before I turn to the panelists for some questions. I'd like you all to think back as we set the framework for thinking about this U.S.-EU relationship to November of 2008. I happened to be in Paris a day or two after the U.S. presidential election, and I will never forget the front page of Le Monde, which had a cartoon by Plantu, their wonderful cartoonist, stripped above the fold, and it showed Barack Obama in a red, white, and blue bathing suit atop a cresting wave, riding a surfboard, shirt off, needless to say, this remarkable young president. And the headline, written in red, white, and blue ink in English in Le Monde, was "Happy New Century," which expressed for that newspaper on that day this sense that something fundamental that would reshape the transatlantic alliance, that would reshape the world had happened. We're now almost a year and a half later. That euphoric sense of being atop a wave, I don't think anybody would quite draw that image today. But we still are left with the basic questions that existed at the beginning of President Obama's term. What is the U.S. conception of the transatlantic partnership? What is Europe's conception of what it would like to see, where it would like this relationship to go? And so I want to start with Kathy as the leading foreign policy spokesman for Europe, just to tell us a little bit about how she envisions the EU agenda in this process of dialogue and debate that's the transatlantic alliance.
Thank you. I think wherever you sat on that day in November politically, it was a great day for American democracy. And I also know that the euphoria that everybody felt was probably impossible to continue, whoever and however marvelous and wonderful Barack Obama, President Obama could have been. So I think we quickly actually have to realize that there's an ongoing relationship across the Atlantic that matters enormously to the European Union, and I would argue matters enormously to the United States of America. And I set it in 2 particular ways, briefly. The first is the kind of bilateral relationship that we have. As Trade Commissioner, I spent a lot of my time looking at some of the very practical ways that we could deal with some of the regulatory framework, some of the issues between us. And that huge trade and investment relationship was a big part of the agenda that I had in that role. So the bilateral relationship is fundamental. It's fundamental for business, it's fundamental for people. The second is the collaborative relationship we have in terms of what we do in the world. Last week I was in the Middle East and I flew directly from there to Moscow to meet with the quartet, where the relationship between the United States and the European Union is really important as part of that group of four, including the UN and Russia. All of the conversations I have about issues that we're trying to grapple with, like what to do about nuclear proliferation and Iran, about how do we tackle the tragedy of the earthquake in Haiti, all of those things are about how do we collaborate together and are ongoing and significant pieces of work. And the final thing I'd say is that what really binds it all together are the values that we hold in common. And because we hold those values in common, we find ways of collaborating together bilaterally and in terms of how we address the rest of the world and the issues that we face. And that will continue, I believe, forever. And I think it's actually, when the euphoria dies down, as it always does, has been the most significant undercurrent that we've continued with.
Kathy, let me just ask you to elaborate on your final point. Alliances that are bound by values, by the perception of shared values, can suffer in very real ways if there's a perception that those values have been breached. And I'd like you to say, as directly as you can, whether you think in Europe there was that sense of breach during the previous administration on values issues because of interrogation policies, because of Guantanamo, because of all the things that we know, and to what extent you think that breach, if it existed, has been eased by an administration that, if we look carefully on some of these policies, actually has had a degree of continuity. In other words, is there a values crisis in our alliance that hasn't yet been fixed?
I don't think there's a values crisis. I think the reality of all administrations, I live in a European Union with 27 governments who have a spectrum of view. And one of the great joys and challenges for me is bringing those views together to form a common European policy where we can. And in the course of that, you're very conscious that some relationships are stronger than others across the world, and that's true transatlantically as well. There are some governments in the European Union who probably feel closer to a democratic America than they do to a Republican America. But I think the underpinning views remain the same. We may not be happy with each other from time to time. There may be issues that create ripples in the system that cause real difficulties. But nonetheless, the underpinning values remain the same.
Tom, I want to turn to you. Back in the old days when American analysts used to speak of Europeans being from Venus and Americans from Mars, and when America was seen as unilateralist and not really paying attention to its allies, obviously there was a desire for a different kind of America. And arguably, you've got it. Americans seem as Venusian as the best Europeans these days, a lot of the time. And I'm wondering if you would speak to this. How does Europe like this more multipolar, multilateral America that it's ended up with?
Well, I think there's a case of be careful that you don't get what you asked for. Because, in fact, I think there's a widespread perception, I think there's enough evidence to prove it, and I think it's completely reasonable that actually Europe is not on the radar screen the way it's been in the past. And for obvious reasons. First, for one, the U.S. Has a problem-solving mentality, and first with the conclusion of the Cold War, and then with the successful integration of both of the EU, within the EU and NATO, of the people who were promised by Churchill in '46 and Fulton and Zurich that they would be incorporated were they to be free. All that's done. The problem is solved. The real problems for the United States are elsewhere and on the radar screen. You have a rising China, you have Iran, you have terrorism, Europe is not a problem, and and this has gotten some people upset. I mean, some people in the eastern part write open letters. I personally don't think writing open letters is a way you deal with foreign policy if you're no longer run by a totalitarian regime. And in the West, we see various stories about who is embarrassed by what gifts and so forth. We're not on the radar screen, but why should we be? I mean, if you take the point of view that the problems that occupied the transatlantic relationship for 60 years have reached a successful conclusion. The countries are democratic, they're defended, and the new members are in, and they're democratic. What else is there? I mean, so the issues it's been solved. And I think that then having a more multipolar America with the issues solved in Europe means that Europe is not the primary issue, and I think the Baroness is right. We're going to be dealing a lot more with trade issues, open skies. I mean, these could be fairly contentious issues. But the feeling that it was actually kind of a luxury from Vietnam through the SS-20s and through the Iraq War that you could vent your anger at the United States because they were so and so and such and such. But in fact, the United States doesn't really have to care that much about Europe because it's done. I would say, not being American, I'm Estonian. We'll hear from the U.S. But that's the perception I get. Don't mind my accent. I'm
going to take you at your word, but I just want to push back on this question of whether Europeans really are content to have this sort of second-tier status. It may be true, as you say, that so many of the problems of Europe are.
That's why I should be careful you get what you want.
Well, what about that? You do hear, certainly in Washington, as diplomats pass through, reading the European press, some sense of frustration that we're not as important to America as we once were, in part because in a world with big problems, our problems are little. What about that sense of being left out of the dialogue, and what would Europeans like to see so that they felt somewhat more attention was paid to them?
Well, if I just read the editorials in UK, France, Germany, not to mention my own country, it's, we have gotten what we wanted and if you want a multipolar world with the United States that is playing in a multilateral situation, it will deal with those issues. About 15 years ago, we complained from my country to a big European country about why they weren't paying attention to us, and their answer was "Mach eine Krise," make a crisis. Because we didn't have a crisis, we weren't on the radar screen. I think that we don't want that with the United States, but it really is, I think, time to, in some sense, grow up. We're not a big problem. And I think the solution we can talk about later on, but I certainly think is that we need to be more creative about what we can do concretely with the United States and in very sort of concrete policy areas. But
David?
We'll get George. Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't agree. I think that the relationship broke down after our unilateral effort in Iraq. We had a few friends, and I remember being at a meeting in Venice of the NATO Interparliamentary Group where they threw paint bombs at the hotel and demonstrated. And I think we've come a long way since then. And one of the things that came up at one of these sessions, I met with Jim Jones at that time, General Jones, and he talked about the issue of smart power, of working with people, gaining more consensus. And one of the things that I think everyone should feel very good about is that President Obama, before he announced his program and what we wanted to do in Afghanistan, really reached out. And in fact, I wrote to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and said I met with NATO parliamentarians, and they said, we're willing to participate, but we want this to be consensus. We don't want to be told what to do. And I think we really reached out to our allies and brought them in and talked about what direction we should take there, how we can work together. And I think that's been well received. And yesterday we heard testimony from Bob Gates and Hillary Clinton, both together talking about military, the hard and soft power, and the fact that I asked him how we were doing in terms of our allies, in terms of Afghanistan. And he said, 2 years ago we had 17,000 people. Today we have 50,000 people, and in most cases there aren't any caveats that are there. And one other issue is the issue of the international financial situation. We jumped in on that. We were concerned about what happened here in Europe. We part of the pressure on us was that we've got to do something out. We have to get out early, because if we don't get out early and let folks know that we care and we're just not going to go and take care of ourselves, this whole thing may just crumble. And there was a lot of money we put into some businesses, AIG and a few others, where the word got out, if you let them go down, you're going to have another Lehman Brothers, and it's not going to be just in the United States, it's going to be across Europe. So I think that most of us realize that we do have a symbiotic relationship with this area, and the more we can work together and cooperate, the better off we're going to be.
Let me just do a brief reality check, then I'm going to turn to Anne-Marie with Kathy. Kathy, did Europe feel the love from Washington in those long months when the Obama administration was debating its Afghanistan strategy? I certainly remember hearing from some European diplomats a sense that they were being left out of a process. Yeah, they were going to be informed when it was over, but that it was not really collaborative. Well, how did it look to you?
From the Brussels perspective, we did feel that we were being involved. I was at the NATO event when General McChrystal came to talk about what was going to happen, the ideas that they had, and then of course we've had subsequently the conference in London on Afghanistan. So that I think for many diplomats, for many people involved in the process, they felt that we were engaged, and that was good. And I think the result of that has been there's a much stronger collaboration in Afghanistan, and I think a much greater sense, and this was certainly true in the London conference, a greater sense of purpose and a greater sense of the possibilities of what we could do together.
Anne-Marie, as you know from our conversations, when I'm really struggling to understand what the Obama administration's foreign policy line is, whether there's an Obama doctrine, I talked to Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was chief of policy planning, has the job of thinking about those big issues. And she's one of the few people that I've encountered who actually can articulate what doctrine you can see hidden within all the cool, nuanced statements of our president. So I hope, Anne-Marie, you might share a little bit of that with this audience.
Well, I will, although I have to say I think you may be reinforcing the worst stereotypes about policy planners when you turn and say, I want a reality check, and then I'll turn back to you. The first thing to say is that the Obama administration doesn't like doctrines. It likes action plans. It likes solving problems. I want to answer your question, but I don't think the White House likes to think about it in terms of a doctrine. On the other hand, there is a very clear concept of the nature of the challenges we face, the fact that they are global problems and they have to be solved together. That's the starting point pretty much for any major speech the secretary gives or the president gives. Lists the top 5 or 6 or 7 global challenges, from nonproliferation to terrorism to the global economy to climate change. These are all problems that have to be solved together. We can't solve them alone. They have to be solved by great powers taking responsibility. Indeed, I was very interested listening to Prime Minister Leterme talk about the G20 and say this isn't a status symbol. The job of the G20 is to initiate global action. It's to take responsibility to initiate global action. And indeed, if you think about President Obama's UN speech, he effectively said to the world, as he said to the United States in his inaugural address, with power comes responsibility. You have to take responsibility to solve collective problems. That's part of the nature of being a great power. It's not just about the size of your economy, the size of your territory, the number of people you have, the size of your army. And that actually is exactly the foundation for the EU-U.S. partnership. And it is a deep partnership. It doesn't make headlines because it's not a problem. That's a good thing. But in preparing for this panel, I just asked for a calendar of U.S.-EU events. And in just the second half of March, there was more than one high-level exchange, delegation, visit, consultation a day. And in Moscow, the quartet, that's the Middle East. That's one of the most of the Israeli-Palestinian and larger problems. It's one of the key problems in the world today. Who's there? The EU and the U.S. and Russia and the UN. If we talk about Iran, we talk about the EU 3+3. We are absolutely partners working closely together because we are two entities that believe we have to take responsibility, that's what leadership is about.
I'm going to ask Tom if he would comment on one specific strategic initiative by this new administration that was planned carefully, executed, I think, with some finesse, and that was what was termed as the strategic reset with Russia. That obviously matters enormously to you as a neighbor of Russia. It upset some of your neighbors just to the west, Poland and the Czech Republic, because it involved, as part of a strategic recalibration, changes in our plans for missile defense. But how would you rate that piece of U.S. policy making? And I'd ask you specifically, going forward, what are the concerns that you would have as an EU president, as president of a Russian neighbor, about how that may play out in the future?
Well, first let me say we'll see. I mean, if START is finalized, signed, and ratified, then I think then we've made some moves. I haven't really heard that was tied to the that was, in fact, it was explicitly said that was not tied to the Polish-Czech decision. Though I could say if you raise that already, informing those countries on the 17th of September, the 70th anniversary of the invasion of Poland, probably shows the radar screen issue to my mind.
Certainly progress on START would have been more difficult if the previous missile defense regime had been in place. I think we can say that.
Yeah, okay, but I mean, reset, if it reduces tensions with Russia, that I think it's a good move. I mean, as I said, I think it's too early to tell, since, we're getting to a point where, in fact, we can evaluate that. In terms of Russian policy towards its Western neighbors, immediate Western neighbors, well, that really hasn't changed. But then again, why should that be affected in any way by U.S. policy? So we'll see. I would just add that when you reset your computer, you don't lose your memory files.
That's a good.
Depends on your program.
No, I can remember an event at the Capitol several months ago, which was commemorating the speech that was made by Václav Havel in 1990. One of the great speeches made in our capital, which really marked the end of this period of Soviet domination of his country and of Eastern Europe. And one of the things I noted for the audience was that Václav Havel and many of the other leaders of the Eastern European movement for change at that time had written a joint letter last year that I'm sure the panelists are familiar with, complaining that they felt that they were now left out of U.S. strategic calculus. And I'd ask.
I said that before. I don't believe in collective letters
right.
Written in a free democratic environment. Collective sort of public letters are written when you're living in a totalitarian regime and you need people to stand up and say we're against this. I think that those points could have been made much more effectively without the public. But that's my personal opinion.
Okay. So that would be a negative about collective letter writing. It still leaves open the question whether the underlying issue that the writers were addressing is one of concern.
David?
Sir.
Again, just maybe it's a little minor issue in terms of the relationships, but we calculated or found that we had a massive public diplomacy problem in terms of our visa program. Mm-hmm. And we put together legislation. In fact, I was the main sponsor of that legislation in the Senate, recognizing that a lot of the countries, including Estonia, felt kind of left out because of the fact that they weren't able to have this visa waiver program. And I think, a couple of, 2 years ago or a year ago, we expanded that by 7. Greece just came in. I mean, the fact is that we do pay attention. And I know that from talking to President Zatlers, when I was in Lithuania, I went up to spend a day in Latvia, and I think there's a feeling there, probably among your people, that we never see them anymore, and so as a result of that, we don't see them, and they're out. They're not on our on their radar screen. But the fact is that you are, and we are concerned about and I I have to say this, that I'm leaving the Senate this year, but I'm going to write a book, and one of the chapters is going to be on NATO expansion and what happened with the European Union and how we transformed this whole area because of the aggressiveness in terms of making NATO available and the European Union. And if you really think about the progress that's been made, and it's not done yet, Kathy and I were talking about it, that we still have and you'll hear from me on several occasions, some challenges in Southeast Europe, because if we don't finish that job there, we're going to end up having a situation where it's not going to be whole, free, and at peace. But there's a good relationship.
I'm not complaining. I was just saying, all I said was that there are bigger issues. That's why we're in Afghanistan on a per capita sort of rate probably in second place, sometimes first, depending on how many troops we have. I'm not complaining about it. I'm saying that there are other issues. And one of the issues that when I think of Europe and the transatlantic relationship that I think really needs to be solved, and which I would, if someone were to ask me, what should we do? I would say solve the Northern Cyprus problem, because the Northern Cyprus problem is what is preventing the EU and NATO from working together, something which initially was proposed by the EU during the Bush administration until about the middle of the Bush administration. Nick can correct me, but anyway, somewhere around there after San Malo, but later on the U.S. administration changed its mind and said, yes, it's a good idea to have the U.S. NATO and the EU cooperating on defense. Let's face it, our big problem is the split brain problem, which is faced by most foreign ministers in those two organizations, because they're in both the EU and NATO. The problem is you can't talk to yourself. Because you're a foreign minister or a defense minister, you're in Brussels and you go to NATO and you talk about one thing and then you can't, and then you come here and you go to Justus Lipsus and you can't talk with the other side. And the two parts of the brain are connected by the corpus callosum, which is this huge bundle of fibers that connects the right and left brain, and those are split in the EU and NATO because the overlap between the two organizations is huge, but because of the Cyprus problem, Turkey does not want or is not very happy about NATO doing something with the EU, and vice versa. Cyprus is not very happy about the EU doing something with NATO. Ultimately, the only way, especially when you have the overlap is so huge, military resources don't have a split brain problem. My country, UK, everyone has their tanks. The question is we don't divide them up in terms of EU versus NATO. We've got to solve this problem. If I were to say there were one issue that we should work on today to get the transatlantic relationship moving is to concentrate on the Northern Cyprus problem.
Kathy, how does that sound like as a work program for the EU High Commissioner?
I spent part of Tuesday in NATO because one of my responsibilities is to develop the strength of that relationship between the EU and NATO. And it is an issue. It's a challenge, I think, is the expression that I'd use in terms of what is feasible. Military people find creative solutions to make sure that we don't fail to protect our people on the ground. But of course, if we could solve the political problems, life would be a lot easier and I would be a lot happier in feeling that we were doing that protection as effectively as we should be. So it is a challenge. But I think I just question, if I might, the underlying proposition, which is we're only interesting when we're a problem. because I don't necessarily accept that. I think the strength of the relationship is that we're not, in a sense, trying to get the attention of the US because we need help. We want to work together with the US in order to see how we can help. And I think that's really the sign of the maturity of our relationship. There are still issues along the borders of the European Union where the US is engaged with us. There are still plenty of issues that we need to resolve between us on an economic basis. But my goodness, there's a lot more we can do together in terms of trying to deal with the sorts of issues that are confronting us in terms of the use of our military, in terms of the use politically of resolving problems. And indeed, as I've already indicated too, in solving some of the issues like the future economic development of Haiti, where next week we've got the conference in New York to look at what we can do together on that.
George, let me take advantage of what you mentioned, the fact that you're retiring from the Senate after many distinguished years there, to ask you about what I think is on the minds of a lot of Europeans, which is the health of the U.S. political and legislative system. We finally came to the end of this long, sometimes painful debate about health care reform. You lived through that. You've seen the institutions, House and Senate, just kind of creaking at the edges, it seemed to me as an observer. As you get ready to leave, I think we'd all be interested in your frank account of what is the health of these institutions, and are there issues on which Europeans should be concerned that we're not making those institutions of governance work quite the way they should?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges that the European Union has is the issue of enlargement fatigue, because there's a feeling, particularly in the area that you asked me before the panel started, David, that what are we doing to pass the baton on to someone else? And I spent a whole week with Jean Shaheen. We did 6 countries, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, or FYROM in some people's mind, and Serbia. And so she's very interested. So my job was, I'm going to pass the baton on to her. I feel as part of my legacy, I want to make sure that somebody picks up that legacy and does something with it. But when you get in there, I met with the Croatians, and the Croatians think we may be the last ones. You meet with the Serbs, we may be the last ones. And when you meet with tripartite presidents in Bosnia, they say, we're never going to get in. And then you get to Macedonia, and they've got the problem of how do you work the Greeks and how can they work the name out. But I think the real issue for the European Union is I know that there is fatigue, but I can tell you this, that if Ali Rehn had not done the job that he did in Serbia, Tadic may not have been elected. He was there and planted the seed that they could go forward, and they had people that wanted to go backwards, and it's something that's very, very important. And I would hate like heck to see the job end. You have this chance to finally bring in that part of the world into Europe, and we've all invested a great deal in Bosnia, Kosovo. People's lives have been lost, lots of money. And I don't think we can just say, well, we're tired and we're going to let it go. I don't think we can. I think we've got to keep working on that and make it happen. And then you're going to have the Euro connection, and it'll improve the Transatlantic alliance, and we'll have a better quality of life and peace.
Let me turn to Anne-Marie for a final comment, and then I'm going to turn to all of you. So please do be thinking of your questions for the panel. Anne-Marie, we talked about a range of issues that are facing the Europeans and us. What are the ones that you're most focusing on, and where you think there are new policies that this audience ought to know about or understand? New U.S. policies.
Well, I'm not sure in terms of new U.S. policies. I think the point that I made about partnership is an important one. I mean, our first year has been spent in building up partnerships and with new powers, emerging powers, essentially looking around and figuring out that we needed to be able to act collectively, figuring out that we needed to work through bigger institutions, moving from the G8 to the G20, trying to work through the United Nations, and then focusing absolutely on Russia, on China, on India, on Brazil, the sorts of things exactly that got the headlines. Well, wait a minute, you're paying attention to all those countries and you're not paying attention to us. Yet the presumption behind all that was we have a strong partnership with Europe. We are working in all these areas, and I think Senator Voinovich is exactly right. There are many areas still in our traditional partnership in Europe's borders with Russia, the U.S., the EU, and Russia working together, but also that we're already working together on development issues in Africa, in Afghanistan. So our focus, I think often we are assuming that we're already working together when we're trying to work with other countries to bring them along gets mistaken for we're not paying attention to Europe. I want to shift those slightly to how we might think about this partnership going forward. And I again want to emphasize that for all the talk about post-Lisbon and how the EU is organizing itself, and certainly Kathy has a great deal on her plate in that regard, it is a huge advantage to us already. Secretary Clinton finds it enormously important to be able to pick up the phone and immediately talk to her EU counterpart, and also, of course, to the prime ministers and the foreign ministers she would talk to. That strengthens our ability to work together in very important ways. And even in the past 6 months, I've seen this day to day. But if we think about how we work together in the world, we do need to move past the Cold War concept of common values. When we say we're bound by common values, we still think the free world versus the communist world, democracies versus non-democracies. Those values are critical. No one would ever think that I would not talk about how important a common commitment to democracy, to human rights is. But in the 70% of the world that's under 30, who haven't thought about, who have no knowledge of the Cold War, who look at the United States and look at Europe and don't ever think about what we stood for against the communist world, we need to think hard together about what we stand for. I would say we stand for open societies. We stand for opportunity. I loved the expression, the modest miracle of a normal life, which should mean a normal life for everyone. We stand for the freedom to connect. If we're talking about young people, we ought to be talking about the freedom to connect to each other, to connect to knowledge. We ought to be talking about women's empowerment, something that we stand for. Look at this panel. Very important globally. I do think we're so focused on how we used to relate. We don't pay enough attention to how we can present ourselves to the rest of the world.
David, could I just say
well
one
said,
thing?
yes, George.
It's prioritization about what are the issues that start from here and go down. One of them that bothers me is the whole issue of energy. It bothers me that some of the people represented here are cutting deals with Russia in terms of energy, and it seems to me if I were doing this, I'd get 4 or 5 countries together and I'd negotiate and from more of a position of strength. Energy is going to be a real issue, and it's going to, if it keeps going the way it is, it's going to color people's judgments politically. They may want to speak out on a particular matter, but they're going to be afraid to do it because they're afraid that they're going to shut off our energy source. And how do you start to look at that? And are we going to work together to have some alternatives that are there? Many of the countries have assets. We've just, for example, discovered the Marcellus gas in the United States, and it's unbelievable what we have, and our price is going to. That's a big issue, I think, that needs to be looked at as climate change. Okay, I've been very much involved in climate change. We have a lot of work to do. If we could really get together and work on this and figure out how you can compromise. For example, we talked about the G20, getting them together to deal with this carbon leakage problem and trying to make sure that when we set up a protocol that is not used by one country against another country to protect their, interfere with trade. But those are the kinds of things I think that that we ought to say, these are big issues. Let's get down. Let's start working on them.
I would add three more, if I could. I'd add three concrete problems that I think we need to address. I mean, one is it's just not enlargement fatigue. There's a constitutional amendment in both France and Austria mandating referendum on any new members of the EU after Croatia, and Croatia is the only one left. After that, that's a concrete thing. So that's not fatigue. It's also changing the legal system. So if we want to do former Yugoslavia, which I think we must do, we need to take those are the concrete challenges. Secondly, I think we do need to deal with what I think everyone seems to be passing over in silence, which is the collapse of the 1975 Helsinki Agreement that you don't change borders through military action, which is the result of the August 2008 war. Helsinki collapsed. I don't buy the argument that comes from the Russian side that, well, the August War shows that it doesn't work anymore. It's a child your child breaks his own toy and says, now give me a new one. It doesn't work. I mean, the same people who broke the fundamental understanding from 75 on, which is you don't change borders through military means, now want something new. I think we have to very seriously address that issue.
Just to ask a journalist-type question on that specific point, do you think that the Obama administration is being tough enough on this question of the inviolability of borders and on the specific instance that you cited, which involves Georgia and the statelets surrounding it? Would you like to see a stronger, more vigorous policy?
Well, compared to the European response, the Obama administration is Arnold Schwarzenegger.
No, I don't accept
because
that.
recall the EU said nothing until the troops leave, and a month later said, oh, let's not pay any attention. The troops are still there. The decision made by the Council that there would be no dealings until the troops leave was quietly forgotten. Basically, and of course in the sense of consensus, we small countries all just said fine.
Kathy, are the Europeans I don't know what the opposite of Arnold Schwarzenegger is, but so if we can imagine some palsied, what about that?
Well,
Don Knotts.
He has Austrian roots, of course, so he's European in that sense. I think I don't accept the proposition. I think where we are is, and we have the Russian ambassador here, we have a vigorous dialogue with Russia. That when I met Minister Lavrov, we talked about Georgia. Yesterday I met the Georgian president. We have 300 people in the region trying to ensure that the agreement that was reached in August 2008 is stuck to. And we use every diplomatic means that we can to try and recognize what we believe in, which is the territorial integrity of Georgia. That's what we do, that's what we stand for, that's what we'll continue to do. And actually the only way is to continue to make that stance, to put people there, to try and build a confidence back in the region and move forward. And that's what we're doing.
I want to go now to the audience because we've got a lot of audience members, I'm sure a lot of questions. I'd like to ask you to keep your questions or comments brief, to identify yourself at the outset. If you have a question for a specific panel member, obviously please direct that to them. I'm going to call first on Marie, who I said before this session I would recognize. Please.
I think
we have a microphone coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's precisely on this subject of the states that are neither Russia nor the European Union or NATO that I'd like to ask a question. It seems to me that the line between the like-minded states and the other states is really the states that have done like the European countries after the war, to believe that the security of people, individuals, is as important as the security of the state. Mm-hmm. And I think it's still very much of a defining line between families of state. And it seems to me that the issue of values that you have stressed at the very beginning was absolutely fundamental in the decades that followed the Second World War because it meant, peace and prosperity. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, then enlargement was the natural course because the European Union and NATO could bring peace and prosperity and constraints on states when it comes to the way they deal with their own populations. And today it seems that it's not quite enough. First, because enlargement is not moving, will not be moving very fast. And also because we are facing more and more, it seems to me, in Europe and also in the United States, the question of interests. How, if we want to go for action, how do we define common interest? And I think energy is a very obvious case. So my question to Thomas Ilves is about everything has been solved after the end of the Cold War. Do you really believe that everything has been solved? Absolutely in Georgia, not. In Ukraine, in Belarus, in the Caucasus? Then how do you define the nature of the problem in those states? And what can the European Union do, and certainly together with the United States and other partners? And my question to Cathy Ashton is about the Eastern Partnership. Do you think it has delivered much? Do you think it can deliver more? What are your perspectives on EU policies toward those in-between states in the years to come? Thank you.
I don't think, it's not that there are no problems. I just think all I said was for the transatlantic relationship, compared to other issues in the world today, it is not a big problem area. Which is not to say that there aren't a whole host of things, and I enumerated some that we should solve. I mean, I personally think that the EU-NATO relationship is one clear task to face. And I would say in terms of the other states, it's precisely the Eastern Partnership, which is actually about the only real idea about what to do with those countries. I mean, what we do with, basically after Bucharest, where we basically left Ukraine and Georgia out to dry, which was initially a response, bringing them into MAP, which was not NATO, it's MAP, was because they weren't getting much attention from the EU. Then they got the no on the map. So basically, there's not enough attention, I think, from either country and from either organization. If you look at the amount of money that's spent, the amount of effort that's put in there, it really doesn't amount to much compared to what has been done in previous, with the enlargements. And I think the fundamental problem is an approach avoidance conflict, as in psychology. You want to get close, but you don't want them to get too close. So you don't really know how much to give them and how much not to give them. Because, I've even been lectured on, don't you dare ever say that Ukraine, from an EU Commission official, previous commission, don't you ever dare say that Ukraine has a European calling. And I said, you're a commission, you work for me. That's the way the Nice Treaty was, right? But the point is that,
Euro's secrets revealed.
People are afraid to bring in Ukraine. People want to hold off on Georgia because it's too messy. And so we end up, Carl Bildt, one of the authors of the Eastern Partnership, can answer you much better than me.
Cathy.
The Eastern Partnership is important and it's quite new. That's the first thing I'd say about it. I think, secondly, if you take one example, let me take the Ukraine. I attended the inauguration of President Yanukovych, and he came to Brussels 4 days later for a day of talks about how best we could support the Ukraine. And that's a combination of the kinds of effective ways in which you can build trade, which is good for everyone, and also the kind of support that we can give him. So, for example, I don't think he'd mind, but one of the things he told me that he was most concerned about was how to support the poorest 20% of the population and what he would be doing to move that on. I also met the now leader of the opposition when I was there and so on. I think what we've got to do is be realistic and practical in the relationship that we have. That I'm not asking Ukraine to make choices about what it wants to do. I want it to be a country that makes its own choices about its future and where it wishes to be. And we want to make sure that it can do so because it's got a vibrant economy, that it's got a good, strong political system, that the rule of law is upheld, that there's no corruption, that people are able to get on with their lives, daily lives, and then decide the relationship together that we wish to have. And that's what I think exporting the kind of value system we hold is all about. So the Eastern Partnership is very important to me. It's very important, I think, in terms of the kind of support we can give. But it's about enabling countries to decide what they want to do. And if they want to be part of us and with us as we look at the future, that's something we can decide together.
I'm going to collect two questions in the hope of getting to as many people as we can. And I'm going to start with the young lady here in the red, and then after her, Admiral William Fallon, who I saw had his hand raised toward the back.
Hi, my name is Petra Stienen, and I want to thank Anne-Marie for pointing out that 70% of the world population is under 30, and I think many of those young men and women would want to live in a society where opportunities are available to them, where they can be free to connect, and women's empowerment is in place, and they're actually knocking at our doors. And I think there's a development at this moment, particularly in my country, it's obvious I'm from the Netherlands, where there is actually a closing of the Dutch mind, and I think there is a closing of the European mind as well towards these people who would want to enjoy similar opportunities. And at the same time, there's also a group of people who have come to Europe, and I think it's the same in the US, who don't adhere to those values. So I think there is a real challenge within our own societies to actually share those values in a way which is not so easy anymore. And what I miss in the discussion is actually, it's a bit abstract to me. I mean, and indeed, the moral or the minor miracle of having a normal life, it seems not possible for many people in our own society anymore. So my question to you is, what is your answer to these people who are knocking at our doors in embassies, in the Arab world, in Asia, who would want to enjoy similar opportunities, because it seems that the democratization, human rights agenda is not at the table anymore? Thank you.
Great question. Think about that. Admiral Fallon.
Thank you, David. Bill Fallon, United States. I want to thank the panelists for some very good points and a broad array of issues. And I would like to pose to each of you, given the many things that are on the agendas in each of our countries, what would you say ought to be the priority tasks, maybe 2 or 3, and why, that we could undertake collectively across the Atlantic to move forward? Thank you.
Should we start with George and then move to our left?
Well, I think I pretty well laid out what I think we should tackle together. And I don't know if this is responsive to your question or not, but we're talking about newcomers that come in, how they're treated, what we do. There's an office called the Office of Democratic Institution and Human Rights in the OSCE. It's located in Poland. They have an Office of Non-Discrimination and Tolerance. And we finally got a couple of people on the core budget of the OSCE, but it needs to be expanded. In terms of education, one of the issues that I'm very concerned about is anti-Semitism, which is growing in this part of the world. Muslim xenophobia is here. And it seems to me that that's an area where a lot more attention should be given because it's a sickness and it grows. And if you just let it, and there's some wonderful things, by the way, going on. I think some of the countries are doing a great job. What I'd love to do is to get them all together and honor the countries that are really making a difference here. But this is a real issue, and I think it's one that should be on the list along with climate change and some of the other issues that I have already talked about.
Kathy, I'd be particularly curious what's in your Admiral Fallon headache pile, if you wanted to speak about that.
I was going to give a brief answer to both, if I might. Let me just start with the knocking at the door, because I think one of the questions that I always ask myself when someone says that is, why are people knocking at the door? And the biggest challenge for many people is the effect of war, of climate change, of being unable to live in the country that actually they'd prefer to live in, which is home. And so one of the big challenges for us, and it in a sense answers Admiral Fallon's question too, which I think is part of the collaboration transatlantically, is how we support development and how we support people who would prefer to stay at home, but either because they're hungry, they don't have economic opportunity or educational opportunity, or they're not free. And that's, I think, a really fundamental part of redressing the issue of why they knock on the door. So the first answer I'd give is we have to build the big economic relationship between the United States and Europe. It still needs work. And the more we do that, the more we enhance the life of our citizens, which is something very important. Secondly, it's finding the things that we can see coming that we need to address. So it's no surprise that I would say the Middle East peace process is really important, particularly right now, with what's happening as we are here. I'd also say the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference is going to be of great significance, again, as we look at that. And the collaboration on peace and security that we do, which addresses some of the big issues, not least our concerns about Iran. Those would be the issues that I would focus on.
Tom.
Those are the big issues I took. Just transatlantically, I would do, as I mentioned, Northern Cyprus, because I think that is what keeps us from doing much more together. We solve that, then we can start talking about real out-of-area missions, real military presence where we need to be, EU capabilities, all of that. And the other issue is finish the enlargements. I mean, bring in Macedonia, bring in Serbia, get that done. Then we finish that piece, which is what is left over from 89, 91, 2004, 2007. We get Europe in. I mean, all of Europe is in, then we are a unit. And if we have that and we have an effective EU, NATO cooperation, then I think we can get rid of talk about sort of the soft power of Europe versus the Martian power of the United States. Then we can do things.
So it is amazing that we've been talking for almost an hour and a half, and I don't think the word China has been mentioned, which is extraordinary and is actually a problem, because we ought to be talking about the transatlantic relationship also in the context of the wider world, and not our banding together against China, but our working together to engage China on a whole host of issues, one of which is directly tied to Kathy's point about deepening our transatlantic economic relationship, and I would tie that to energy and climate change. I think we have an extraordinary opportunity looking forward as we develop green technology to develop common standards for that technology, both so that we are a source and we stand for green energy, new sources of energy, but also because if we do that, we together are an amazing force globally and in Asia as well. There are a number of other areas also on development where I think we need to be working together deeply. That's also important with respect to China elsewhere in the world, engaging China so that its investment in development is beneficial. I would say there also that gives me a chance just to say one other thing that David asked about a new policy. If I had to say what else is really new about the Obama administration and about the President and Secretary Clinton's focus on the world, it is that they both see that every problem we face has to be tackled from a development perspective as much as from a diplomatic perspective. I just sat at the U.S.-Pakistan Strategic Dialogue and heard Foreign Minister Qureshi explain that the biggest problem facing his country in terms of development and then in terms of countering terrorism and violent extremism was agricultural development. This from the foreign minister of one of the most strategic countries in the world. So the U.S. and the EU have an extraordinary opportunity to put together what between us is 80% of the world's overseas development assistance and put that to work in ways that complement one another and truly benefit each other. I will just put in a last plug also for Cyprus, because in terms of what it unlocks, in terms of what then we could do in the Middle East more broadly. Let me end by answering your question. I think you raise a very important point. I said we stand for open societies, which is simply the 21st century. It's of course a 20th century term. It's Karl Popper's term. But as we look around the world, again, post-Cold War, standing for an open society together is vital, and we need to work on ourselves at home as well as abroad. We need to do a lot of work in Europe, in the Netherlands, in our own society. If you look at, I just left, there were death threats against people who voted for health care. Those are not the values of an open society. The racism and the anti-immigrant fervor is not an open society. So we need to work on our own open society values and then figure out how we stand for that in the rest of the world.
I'm going to expand my list to 3 people whose hands I saw earlier, and hopes of getting to people. First, you, and then Madam, you, and then John. And again, please keep your questions, interventions brief.
Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform. I actually wanted to also mention China, as Anne-Marie did. It strikes me that everybody, not just Americans and Europeans, Indians and other people too, are finding China more difficult to cope with. It's more assertive of its own interests. But we're not collaborating together in how we deal with that. There's a debate going on in the US about the Chinese currency and how to respond to it. It's in the debate in Europe, but they're happening apart. And surely we've been far more effective in persuading China to change its policies if we actually work together, not just on currency, also on Iran, of course, also on climate change, also on some human rights issues. So, and trying to get China to open up its markets better to our companies. So my question to the panelists is, don't they think we can actually do rather more to work together on Chinese issues? And not everybody in Europe, I think, wants to do that. They see some advantage in having an attitude towards China that's different from that of the US, but I would think we should work together more than we do.
Madam.
Not from the Belgian Prime Minister's office. But before that, I traveled the world as a journalist for 30 years. So my remark has been partly phrased already by the young lady in red behind me. But Mrs. Slaughter, my one remark on what you said, which I liked very much, is that talking the language of values is Cold War talk. But I give you one instance. In 1991, I was at a conference in Windhoek of publishers and editors of the whole of Africa. And they agreed that freedom and press freedom is not an obstacle, but a condition for progress and for development. And we now live in an atmosphere where promoting those values, which I think are essential, are considered either as a kind of neo-imperialism or get the answer, well, first look at yourselves. Of course, our societies are not perfect, but there's a huge difference in grade value between them. So my question is, how do we go about to helping the people who look to us for help, not the governments, but giving a voice to the voiceless?
John. Do we have a microphone for yes?
My name is John Kornblum. I'm a former American diplomat who lives in Berlin. I wanted to pick up on this issue because I think things are not solved between the United States and Europe, and I think this discussion has raised a very important point. Is the building of a transatlantic community a deeper one, a more institutionalized one, in which the United States is also a very active institutional participant in Europe? Is that a Cold War goal, as Ms. Slaughter seems to suggest? Or is that, in fact, the essence of building democracy around the world? You can imagine what I think. And I'm afraid that the panelists, especially the policy planning chief, have actually confirmed doubts that many people in Europe and the United States have, that the Obama administration is essentially a transactional one, looking at goals, not at values and not at structures. And if you look at the kinds of issues that Thomas raised, that many other people raised, we have deeply structural things. Senator Voinovich made very clear. We have an immense part of Europe which needs still to be put back together. The United States-Europe relationship was always built on the understanding that we would be able to overcome some of these horrible things. We had an immense confrontation with Europe over the Balkans in the early 90s, for example. But we always overcame them because we always believed that we were moving towards a sense of community. And now to have a sense of transactions as the basis of American policy, I think is a dead end, I have to say. It's leading us to conflict, not friendship.
Let us, in my business we always say, let me hold your coat so you can fight. John. invisibly holding your coat. Anne-Marie, why don't you
John,
lead off?
You fundamentally misunderstood me, and you cannot possibly think that I, of all people, do not believe in a deeply institutionalized transatlantic relationship based absolutely on our fundamental values. There is no stronger champion of that relationship than I am, by blood and by heritage and by commitment. Absolutely, and I think what we've been talking about is precisely that post-Lisbon, we are in a better position to be partners, fundamental partners, solving global problems precisely because we share common values and institutions, and we need to deepen those institutions in every way I can think of. Economically, politically, that's exactly why I think it's so important that Cathy Ashton and Hillary Clinton can work together as equal counterparts. All I meant to say, and let me make no mistake about it, we have common values based on liberty, democracy, justice, equality, tolerance. These are the Enlightenment heritage, they're universal values, and they are best expressed here. All I meant to say was, in the world as a whole, describing them that way, which is how we grew up, how we understand them, is not always framed, we're not always speaking the language of the people we need to talk to. The open society is just another way of describing a liberal democracy, but my point is, to many, the idea of an open society, the idea of being able to connect the freedom of the internet, women's empowerment, opportunity, is a language that is better understood. So I was simply suggesting we update our vocabulary, not our values. I want to be very clear about that. And as for transactions, these aren't transactions. We face global problems that if we don't solve, proliferation, terrorism, climate change, global epidemics, the stability of the global economy, if we don't solve those together, we all go under. And I'm suggesting the United States and Europe be partners in helping everyone else solve those problems.
Ambassador Nick Burns, who for many years was a prominent figure, often spokesman for the George Bush administration, told me he has what we call in conference land a two-finger intervention, which means it's so apposite, so precisely on this point that he needs to speak now. So we'll see whether Nick is really deserving a two-point intervention.
Thank you, David. I just wanted to strongly agree with Anne-Marie. What I admire about President Obama and Secretary Clinton is I think they're transitioning this relationship between Europe and the United States from being about Europe. That was the Cold War agenda, the problems of Europe in the past, to be about the rest of the world. So the challenge, I think, is can Europe and the United States work on the Middle East together and the myriad problems there, on South Asia and on East Asia, where vital interests are present for both of our communities. And I'm rather optimistic that we can not only define that agenda but pursue it. And I just think that maybe the two Europeans on the panel might want to speak to the challenge that Anne-Marie put down about how do we deal with China? And how do we take advantage of the opportunities with India?
I'd like to ask Cathy, who inherits these portfolio, after a difficult week, to put it mildly, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Obama administration, in which sources close to Netanyahu were saying to journalists like me, we don't understand where this relationship is. There's an obvious question of whether there's an opening for the EU at a time of unusual estrangement between the United States and Israel. Is there a new role? How do you think about that? Maybe if you could briefly address that, and then we'll go back to the audience.
Well, it's not about having an opening, because the implication of that is that this is not a relationship where actually we're talking to our partners, and the Quartet is the most obvious place where Russia, United Nations, the United States and Europe try and work together. I met with Prime Minister Netanyahu last week when I was in the Middle East, and I made it very clear to him that in my view, for the benefit of the people of Israel, he needs to move to the proximity talks that Senator Mitchell is moving forward with. He needs to do it now, and he needs to do it with a view to resuming full talks as swiftly as possible. That's in the interests of the people of Israel. It's also in the interests of all of the people who are in the occupied territory of Palestine, and of course having gone into Gaza, I can say for the people of Gaza. There's no question in my mind. The issue, I think, that is very important is that we're working together with the United States on how best to try and achieve that. And I think it's very important and significant that you have a president of the United States who's being very robust in all his relationships in saying what needs to happen. And I think that's going to be very significant as it plays out in the Middle East. But there's no doubt in my mind that working together is what makes a difference. I had a phone call from Prime Minister Fayed the day before yesterday to thank me as part of the quartet for the statements that we've issued and for the way in which that collaboration is having an impact in the politics in the Middle East. So that's what we do. It's about working together. It's about finding ways that we can put the right pressure on everyone to try and get to the table, because that's going to be of enormous significance, not just for this generation, but for all the young people we were talking about earlier.
Let me return to the audience for a final round. I'm going to collect 4 questions with apologies to others, and then we'll turn back to the panel for
There was
final
a guy in the back
comments.
that had a question about China and our relationship
Yes.
with them. We never answered it.
Well, you know, we did speak some about China, but if you'd like to...
The bottom line is that, in my opinion, first of all, how many of people that are here, how much of your debt is held by foreign countries? Our debt today in the United States is about 52 or 53% held by foreign entities, China, Japan, and the OPEC nations. China's 7%. And the fact of the matter is, in my opinion, this has some impact upon what our relationship is with China. I mean, that's the way it is. Since 2004, we have borrowed 70% of our money, not from the people in the United States, but from other people. And so we have a real problem here, and one is that the United States' debt, we just raised it to $14 trillion. Last year we borrowed $1.4 trillion. 40% of our country's last year's budget was borrowed. Now, if the United States keeps going in that direction, we are in deep trouble. And you want to know what? Everyone's in trouble. And I think that one of the things that overriding this is if the United States does not get its financial house in order, it's not going to not only impact on our quality of life, but it's going to impact on peace in the world. And that's something that we've neglected for too long. And I'm hoping that the President, when he has appointed this commission finally to look at entitlements and look at tax reform, is going to really do something about this problem.
Let me turn to the audience for 4 quick final questions. There was a woman far in the back, yes, in the white blouse first. A gentleman here who actually, the first man to have his hand raised, Bill Drozdiak. And, sir, you had your, yes. So we'll conclude with those final 4, and then our panel will have a chance to say whatever they want to conclude.
From the Open Society Institute. Of course, I welcome very much Anne-Marie's focus on the open society. Nobody in this room is going to contest fundamental open society values. The issue is the hierarchy of needs, is the ranking and the priorities that are accorded to values as opposed to other concerns. And I wonder if I could ask the panel, given how much you've all stressed cooperation on practical solutions to world problems and on joint action plans, how you would deal with the question of values and other issues when it comes to Iran. What would a common action plan, for example, between the US and the EU at this point in time, let's leave aside the history of this issue for a little while, what would it look like both to contain proliferation and also to open Iranian society? What could be, at this point in time, given all of the interests and all of the actors involved, a joint EU-US action plan?
Good question. I'm glad somebody raised Iran. Sir.
William Wallace, British Parliament. I'd like to pose to you one of the questions put in as a guiding question here, which is, what's the use of EU-US summits? And how does one make them attractive enough for American presidents to want to come out? I think what I heard Anne-Marie say was, we meet all the time, as far as business is concerned. By implication, it's better to get on that way and not have these set pieces. It's not just recent ones have been disastrous. I remember the first Bush administration in Gothenburg all those years ago, where Bush came away intensely irritated by 15 European heads of government all wanting to say the same thing to him. Is it best to get rid of EU-US summits because they are set pieces which are grandstands opportunities for too many heads of government competing with each other in the EU, or is there still a role for these if and when the EU can agree on a common agenda and common spokespeople to present it?
Another good question. Bill Drozdiak.
You take Iran. I'll take that one.
Thanks, David. I just wanted to add the other factor that has not been mentioned in this conversation has been the worst economic downturn since the 1930s and its impact on the transatlantic relationship. We just had a summit here the last 2 days of the European Union where more and more we're seeing European politics become more national in nature. So if anything, Europe seems to be turning inward. And one could also make that same argument about the United States, given the magnitude of our economic problems. So are we running the risk that in what people are calling more and more the decline of the West and the rise of an Asian century, a possibility that Europe and the United States are turning inward and thus away from each other in dealing? Because I certainly haven't seen any evidence of great U.S.-European initiatives in solving the global financial crisis.
Sir, last question.
My name is Monji from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. The challenges that the transatlantic relation should deal with are global ones. And as Japan shares the same value with Europe and the United States, we'd like to take part in that effort. And so far, we have been trying to promote Japan-US relations and Japan-EU relations separately. But there may be value if we go directly into transatlantic relations, like us going to Brussels Forum, and also Japan has been trying to ties with NATO, where Europe and United States are together. How do you see this idea?
So let's turn to our panel. Anne-Marie, let me ask you to start, and then we'll go around the circle. Choose whichever of those you like.
I'm going to choose William Wallace's question on the summits, because I also read the question, and it essentially said, how can Europe make the summits interesting enough for the United States to come? And I thought that is an absolutely terrible way to frame the question. That implies Europe is some kind of supplicant. Europe is a partner. It shouldn't be about making something interesting enough so that somebody else comes. When they are fora where we work together to solve problems, they will work. I don't think they're essential because of the tremendous amount of interaction we have. I also think, though, exactly as the EU moves into the post-Lisbon era, there's a great deal that could be done, but the idea that we need a summit to get things done, as we do with many other nations, that's simply not true with the EU. It's a fundamentally different quality of relationship.
Tom?
Well, summits finalize work that's been done before. If you haven't done the work before, then it is a tourist opportunity, but that's it. On values, well, I think that we have to deal with our own values a little bit here, because be it pipelines, warships, or all kinds of other things, if there's an opportunity to make a profit, then values sort of go down on the Maslowian scale. And so I think in terms of Iran or any other place, we need to have, it's one place where we need to have a common position, I think, more. And I think that applies just as much to China. And in fact, if you look at the, I don't know where we are today on the arms embargo, but here the United States was against selling arms to China, and countries that otherwise take a very moral position in the EU were all for selling arms to China. No, I think we need to develop our common position there. And I remember when I was in the European Parliament, we had a lot of fights on that. And sometimes values just disappear. On economics, I just watched a British film about, I think, Liverpool or Manchester in the 1950s, or if you look at pictures of post-World War II Europe, it was much more grim than it is today. And so, in fact, I just gave us 2 speeches on the issue that we cannot use the economy as an excuse to allow our relations to somehow fall apart. The economy is, yes, bad. On the other hand, if you look at what Europe looked like until the middle 60s, there wasn't much here. Everyone was working on cleaning up rubble or having a Wirtschaftswunder. But basically it was, I don't think we can, the economy, yes, is tough, but the economy and the decrease is worse than ever before. Where we fell from is still so much higher than we were in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and then it worked, the relationship.
Kathy.
Well, I'll start by saying that as I inherited 3 people's jobs, any summits we don't have to have are good news for me. And in fact, what I've been doing with ministers, and that's true of Secretary Clinton, it's also true of Minister Lavrov in Russia, is trying not to have too many set-piece occasions because we meet each other all over the world all the time. So Secretary Clinton and I will have a bilateral, we're in Canada on Monday and Tuesday, then we're in New York, and we'll have our bilaterals while we're on the road. And that's a much better way of dealing with the kind of practical things we have to deal with. Summits are important without question, either because they're ways of strengthening relationships that need strengthening, or because there are particular things that you want to achieve. And the relationship with the US is such that we will have a summit when we both feel we need to have one in order to do something that a summit would be useful for. Meantime, the relationship goes on. In terms of Iran, I think we're already actually collaborating a great deal on the issues of proliferation through the work we're doing towards the Security Council. I've spoken with Hillary Clinton about that on a number of occasions, and in Europe we're working on that too. So that part of it. And in terms of values, well, one of the things that's just happened, which is the European Parliament initiative, was opening a new station for the Iranian people to be able to get information from broadcasts from Europe. And there is issues, as you know, about what's happening on that now. We're also trying to support society in the right way for the things that we do. So there's a lot of work that we do and a lot of work we do where we collaborate with the US. I just want to say a word on China, because I've been talking about China at the European Council this morning in a kind of post-Copenhagen world and so on. And I described it that we have to move from an attitude to a strategy. And I think there's a lot actually within the European Union we've still got to do to bring together our thinking on China. Remember that this role was created specifically to be able to try and draw those things together more effectively. And China's certainly an area where we need to do that. And part of what I've been saying is we then also have to make sure the partnership of how we approach not just China, but I think India, I think South Africa, I think Brazil, and obviously in everything that we're doing with our relationship with Russia, there's lots of things we have to talk about with each other that we need to do more on.
George, last word.
Well, it seems to me that we have a proliferation of challenges. And
yeah.
if I were president, I'd get the teams together from the United States and get Kathy in the room, spend a week, and make a list of things that need to be done, priority, number 1, 2, 3, understanding that you can't get them all done, and then go through the list and say which are the ones that we could maybe get done quicker than something else. Let's do the doable, and then have an agenda and start to drive it. But the trouble today is that you have these things coming in all the time, and what happens is your attention gets drawn away from the basic things that need to be done. And I think if we could do that, we would be far better off than where we are today.
Let me bring this to a close. Listening to this, my own sense is that this is a period in which both the U.S. and the EU are looking inward, trying to deal with problems in their own union, economic problems of economic recovery. That's appropriate, but it makes all the more important the outward-looking parts of this relationship. And I would just like to ask you to thank all the panelists, but specifically I want to note George Voinovich is retiring from the Senate at the end of this term. George Voinovich is one of the people who makes our Congress work. There are a lot of dysfunctional things at work that you read about all the time. But having known George Voinovich, he's one of the people who's always ready to think and listen and try to figure out a way, try to figure out how to be in that space where you govern and make things done. So I want to especially note and ask you to join me in thanking George.